Professor Shay joined the Washington and Lee faculty in 2009 as the Johnson Professor of Entrepreneurship and Leadership. He has also taught at LSE, Peking University, Cornell University, etc. Apart from teaching, Professor Shay has worked on research extensively and received a number of awards. Most notably, he has presented his research and has received Best Paper Awards at Academy of Management. So without further ado, may we now invite Professor Shay.
Thank you very much. I wish I could be there with all of you in person. So hello from the United States, where it's 8:48 at night for me. So when I was first contacted, I was very excited because I've done a lot of work in the in the area. Been to Hong Kong a few times, China, mainly Beijing, and then other parts there. But the interesting challenge was basically coming up with something that in 40 minutes or so would provide the best value added for you. So I think I'll just get started here. So the first thing I just want to talk about is that the turbulent times that we're in, if you look at it, you read articles all the time that tuition prices are going up, and then the perceived degree value for higher education is going down. Well, this makes professors like me kind of very frustrated in trying to figure out what to do. We even have articles in like the New York Times that are, pretty rude towards what we do in higher education. And then we have people that are writing whole books about how a higher education is failing us, whether or not even a business degree is worthwhile. And then we have billionaire Peter Thiel, who basically said that thinks higher education is a waste of time. And then he was paying people to actually drop out of higher ed. I think this was about a year or year and a half ago, and that he would pay for them to do startups. So when I sit there and I get the question quite often from people, are you afraid? Are you afraid with all the articles that are out there and books and everything? Are you afraid that you won't have a job? And so when I look at the landscape, I look back and I say, well, maybe they have a point. Have we really adapted to the current environment? This is actually a picture of a lecture in 1856. And if we look at a modern lecture today, it's not too different in terms of what happens. It's basically passive learning where people are just speaking at, large groups of students. And you have to question whether there's real value added by the professor. So the old methods worked in higher education basically when we possessed key competitive advantages. First, we held the keys to intellectual capital. We conducted the research, we had the faculty, and we had the libraries, and essentially you had to go to college or graduate school in order to learn and have access to this information. Back then it was the sage on the stage, the professor was the source of information. So obviously you had to go to college or to graduate school in order to access this information. In the information age, unfortunately, these competitive advantages have diminished or eroded, and it's very easy for people to get the same types of information on the internet or to take online courses or do, acquire and access information, intellectual capital, and even get credentials without ever attending a higher education institute. So how can we respond to these changes? First, I believe that we have to transition from solely knowledge dissemination to greater emphasis on skill and ability development. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. Second, we need to understand the retention effectiveness of various teaching pedagogies and select methods that provide the greatest value-added experience for students. One of the things that I think is ironic is I wish I could be there because it's very odd for me. This is, sitting in front of a camera and a microphone and a screen. Usually I go through a couple pairs of shoes a year running around the classroom and engaging with people. So let me tell you what I mean in terms of the knowledge, skills, and abilities. When we look at it, these are really the three basic things. If you look at any training literature, any any kind of leader education program, they're looking at these three areas. And when we look at knowledge, knowledge is just an organized body of information. It may be required, to perform a specific job. Um, it's basically what we're looking for there is we're looking to have our students have basic command of the information needed. Just think about that as knowledge is just information. In passive learning, the professor's role is easily replaced in the information age because we can, for example, I could put this lecture online and people could learn all about my tips and strategies and tactics for teaching case studies. So the next one is skills. And skills, it refers to proficient manual, verbal, or mental manipulation of data or things. It's an observable competence to perform a learned activity. For example, if you are going into finance as a job, you would be able to analyze various spreadsheets, perform discounted cash flow analysis, and so on. And so that they're learned competencies that you have. And then the last one is abilities. It's the power or capacity to perform an activity or a task. And it's the competence to perform an observable behavior. Think about this in terms of capacity. And so for the last two, skills involves really active learning. The professor's role is not replaceable in this case. So if you focus on teaching students skills, it's very difficult to replace that with any type of just passive learning, internet information, things like that. In this case, we become learning coaches, mentors, and facilitators. And for the ability side, the professor plays a vital role in motivating and inspiring the students to reach their full potential. So our role, if we look at what it is that we can actually do with our students in order to make ourselves not obsolete, we need to really focus on skill and ability development and maybe to leverage other ways that we can disseminate the knowledge, that information that they need in order to perform the skills or be motivated to higher capacity levels. So one of the other things that I think that's really important is when you look at the National Training Laboratory study about the different types of pedagogies or approaches to teaching that are out there. So we have the traditional passive, that we've been using in higher ed and K through 12 education, for centuries now. Which is basically lecture, reading, audio-visual demonstration. And then we have this active learning. Active learning consists of discussion groups, practice by doing, teaching others, and the immediate use. And when we look at the retention rates, it's astounding to me that we still get away with doing lecturing in the first place because the retention rate is only 5% from lectures. So even when we combine that with lecture and then if the student does the reading, we're only getting up to 10 or 15% retention. And so when we see articles questioning the value of the education that we provide, if we are only assigning readings that students could get from anywhere, and we're lecturing about those readings, then it's easy to see why there might be frustrations with what's going on in higher ed. And so when we look at it, the traditional lecture leading to an exam method of teaching, or some online courses, that don't have much interaction with the students by the professor, there's a decrease in the value added by professors. We really can't add much value to what is already out there on the internet for students and other people that want to learn that they have access to. Down here at the bottom, there's a real opportunity for us to add value through cases, projects, and active learning. And that's why when you look at, for example, in my classes, I have students that come back to me 5 or 10 years later saying that they're still using the same tools. And the reason why is because I have them learning the tools through active learning, and they're retaining what they learned. And I think that's a really important thing to start off with this morning for you. So the case method addresses these issues by, first of all, case studies provide opportunities to apply knowledge while developing the skills and abilities to solve real-world problems. And these real-world problems are of interest, and they're motivating to students to be able to work on real problems facing real managers and real employees. So this is the discussion groups, practice by doing, teach others, immediate use. All of those things that I just talked about with active learning are there. And then for the inexperienced, case studies contextualize abstract theories, concepts, and ideas. And in doing so, they actually provide experience for people. So I don't want to get into a long story here, but when I graduated from Babson College in 1987 with an undergraduate degree, people were surprised 6 months later when they found out that I had my own consulting business and that I was providing consulting services for people twice or 3 times my age. And people asked, why would they listen to you? And in part, they listened to me because I had done so many case studies and I had acquired so many skills and abilities that I was actually marketable and saleable and valuable in the marketplace. And that's where it becomes really important for case research and for case teaching. So I know that Professor Sui mentioned a little bit about my background. I just want to, this gives you an idea of where kind of contextually where this talk comes from. I've taught around the world. My PhDs from Cornell, BS and MBA from Babson. And I've done case workshops in your area. I've done them for AAPBS, for KAIST, Petronas Leadership Center, Hong Kong Baptist University, and a number of other institutions around the world. I really enjoy this because I enjoy running into professors a year later after they adopt the case method and become better case teachers, because teaching is no longer a chore. It's something that they're excited and engaged to be involved in. To give you a little bit of context of the courses, you can see I've taught a wide range of courses, won some teaching awards, and then my evaluation scores, which I know for any of you that are looking for promotion and tenure that are important, on the effectiveness score, over 20 years, my average is 4.7 out of 5.0. Now, I'm not saying that to brag or anything like that, but I'm saying that to tell you that these are the results that you can have with using the case method for teaching. I've also continued to publish in several different journals. My case experience, we figured it out. If you do an MBA and a BS degree at Babson College, you will have analyzed over 1,000 cases. At Cornell and my PhD, we did about 50. And since I became an academic, I wrote 10 and taught about a little over 75 cases at Montana. And then at Washington and Lee, I've written 7 more, and I have taught about 25 different cases. Mainly right now, my teaching is in the area of strategy and entrepreneurship. So what I'm going to talk about in the next 35 minutes or so, and then I'll turn it over to questions, is I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the case method, then some things on course design and development, then first class session, and then some cultural considerations for those of you that may be skeptical as to whether or not the case method will work in your part of the world. And what I've done with each of these topics is I've narrowed down, typically I give at the case workshops, I give a full day or day and a half on case teaching and a full day, day and a half on case research. So what I've done is I've kind of made the assumption that you guys all know about the case method, and I've kind of highlighted areas that people have found interesting, and that you might not find these tips and tactics online anywhere. So first of all, the case method is just an overview. It's a real world managerial decision context as the basis for learning. It's an interactive discussion format. If you see down below, if you're lecturing about a case, then you are still replaceable. Let that sink in for a second. So a case study is not to have the students read the case and for you to read the case and for then you just to sound smart up on the stage. Instead, it's for you to lead a discussion, an interactive discussion, because that's what will be required. That's what we're preparing students to do in the real world. It requires student preparation and engagement. Some of you might be saying right now, I've tried cases, but I can't get my students to do the work, to prepare and to engage. Well, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. And through this, students develop analytical, critical reasoning, oral and written communication, interpersonal and creative skills. Think about all of those different things. And if you're designing your courses properly, you still find out whether or not the students actually know the material that you presented in terms of the information for the course. So cases are unique, though. They're unique in that it's a shared learning responsibility. It requires the professor to design a course, to select cases, to prepare discussion, to facilitate learning, and to reflect on the class so that the next time when they use the same case or use this, talk about the same concepts and frameworks, that they do even better. The students have to read the case, apply the tools, prepare the analysis. They have to engage in small group discussions before, and then they have to participate in class. If either one of these things is not present, either the professor doesn't do a good job of designing the course or the students don't do their part, there really isn't learning. And I will tell you, one of the exciting things about the case method is that your classes actually become exciting and you learn something. I can't say that I learn something every single day that I discuss a case, but I would say probably 50% of the time that I spend leading discussions with students, I learn something new. And that to me is exciting because that's the reason why we all became professors in the first place. So how does the learning actually take place? There's 4 basic areas. First, it's the discovery, the students reading the case on their own and interpreting and making meaning of the facts using the course concepts and tools. Then in class, the professor asks probing questions and challenges students. And then there's the practice, the process of breaking down the facts and issues and applying analytical tools that become intuitive through repetition. So think about this with your classes. Your classes, for my classes, whether it's strategy or entrepreneurship, the analytical tools and concepts and ideas that are introduced in the first case of the year typically are still in play and still used in the last class of the year. So that means for a 15-week class with 13 weeks of cases, that means there's 13 times that they've practiced something. My students become really good at using the tools in my classes. And then contrast and comparison. Students learn to learn from prior experience. They learn the ability to basically say, hey, we talked about ExxonMobil early in the term, and now we're talking about British Petroleum and Petronas Oil. What did we learn about that first case? How does that apply in this case? And in doing so, it makes them better managers, better leaders in the future. So what are the advantages? First, as I mentioned before, active learning equals higher retention. The second one is that you get real-time student comprehension feedback. Classes that are taught only with exams, you find out at the midterm or the quarterly exams and the final exams whether the students know anything, whether they did the reading, whether they understand what you've presented on the lecture days in your classes. This provides the opportunity for real-time comprehension and feedback. You ask a question, the students answer. If enough of them answer the same way that it shows that they don't understand the concept, then you take time and you go over that concept again. It facilitates critical thinking and judgment. It bridges the classroom real-world gap by providing students, rather than just questions, essay questions, or multiple choice questions on a test, it provides them with complex, unstructured problems with ambiguous and incomplete information. Nowhere in their life are they going to go out and work and have somebody say, do the odd problem that's at the end of chapter 4 and you'll be all set for work on Tuesday. Cases allow students to actually feel like they're in the real world and to practice what it's like being in the real world. And the last one is that it's a valuable heuristics for their professional career. Again, like me, having done 1,000 cases as an undergraduate and an MBA, I relied on those in my consulting because they became my experience and they became lessons that I could pass on to my clients. So a few things on course design and development. One of the biggest questions that I get quite often is, how do you evaluate class participation? Well, over the years, I can honestly tell you that I've learned from trial and error, but I've come up with some purposeful measures and methods. So the first one is, should we be calling it class participation or class contribution? For example, right now, if we were to give all of you a grade for class participation, you would all get an A. You're all there, you're looking at the screen, and you are participating in this educational opportunity. But how many of you, if I was going to grade you on contribution, how many of you would be receiving an A? The answer is, in my book, none of you would. And the reason why is that you haven't participated or you haven't contributed to our learning experience. So the message that that single word can send is important. I would encourage all of you to change it in your syllabus for next term. Change the word from class participation to class contribution, and you'll see a change in the behaviors of your students. The next question that I get from people is, what percentage of your final grade should your class contribution count for? I'll tell you right now that in my school, I'm fortunate to have very small class sizes. My current school, I have class sizes between 17 and 20 students. So with that, I have class contribution between 30 and 40% of the class because I teach case-based classes. Now, there is an inverse relationship, however, with how much you should put your percentage and the number of students in a class. If you have a class of 50 or 60 or 70 students, it wouldn't be fair to put 40% of their class contribution grade based on make it 40% or higher. So you need to think about what makes sense and what makes sense to have everybody engaged in what we're doing. The next one that's important is a mid-semester check-in with the students. And by that, what I mean is providing them with feedback as to how they're doing. Otherwise, they're sitting in the class and they have no idea how well they're actually doing. Another question that people ask is, what should my expectations be for preparation and the sophistication level of the analysis that students will do? Excuse me. Well, when I look at undergrads, by the time they are in their senior year, I have very high expectations of them. But if you look on the curve, they're only going to reach about a quarter to a third of the way up of where I would expect a MBA student in their second year to be. Now, MBA part-time MBAs, I actually have lower expectations for them because they have another job. And then the least expectation I have is probably surprising to some of you, but that's for execs and exec ed. And the reason why is that a lot of exec ed programs are as much for the networking as they are for the education. And the execs are typically still trying to do work back with their home company. So just make sure your expectations are fitting for the audience that you have. So in terms of how you evaluate that class contribution, what I have is I have cards for each one of my students. They're made up with the dates for all of the class sessions. And every time, it needs to become a habit. Every time I finish a class, I come back to my office and I run through the cards and I make note of who participated, and I have a 1, 2, 3 system. 1 is basically they were there and maybe they said something, but it was not significant. 2 would be they were there and made one significant comment. And 3, they were very highly engaged in the discussion. And then I do something that's probably surprising to some of you, which is I also ask them to complete their own evaluation and to evaluate their fellow teammates. This changes the dynamic. First of all, it requires that the students really think about on a daily basis whether or not they're participating and whether or not they're contributing to the learning that's taking place. The second part is by asking them to evaluate their peers, they're making it so that the class itself is important. It's important because if the people on my team are not participating or not contributing or not going to class, then on the work that we're assigned, whether it's a strategic plan, a business plan, a case analysis, they're not going to be able to fully participate because they weren't engaged when they were in class. So what do you do about participation problems? What do you do when you have low participation? If it's by the whole class, you ask questions like, are the students preparing? Is the environment inviting participation? Are you doing the right things as a professor? If it's just individual students, you have to look at, are you providing opportunities for them to speak? If it's poor participation, in terms of people are just saying anything, you have to question whether or not you're accepting poor quality, because then that means any student can just say anything. So if you have a passive class, these are the tactics that I would suggest. The first one is to be consistent with the daily flow of your class. How does the class proceed every day? Use the same board plan outline. I'll share mine later. And this makes the students be able to anticipate when they can prepare. And in essence, one of the things I suggest that my students do is that they prepare in their notebooks their own board plan outline for the case to be discussed, because then they'll know what facts, what information, what concepts, models, frameworks, whatever they'll need to do. You can also pre-assign case questions and frameworks to apply for the case. You can start off with small group discussions. This is one of the things that I know a bunch of people at that were in one of my workshops over at Hong Kong Baptist University have tried with great success. And that is, in the Asian culture, it's very difficult because sometimes students don't want to participate as individuals. So the way that you start to facilitate this is you start off by having smaller groups of students discuss their ideas for the case, and then they share their ideas, their solutions with the larger group, and then basically move up to the whole class. The reason for doing these things is that you need to build comfort level and have the students feel like it's an inviting opportunity for them to speak up. So teams, how do you form teams? Well, most professors do things like they have the instructor form the team, or they say form teams now. When the instructor forms teams, they try to balance the teams, but if the team does not succeed, the students always have an excuse. The instructor is blamed for the problems or poor performance. If I told you all to form teams right now, where would you join teams with? You join teams with the people right around you. So what we do is, in that case, again, the instructor is blamed once again. So the process that I use, because teams are essential for case analysis, is that I simulate the real world. I have a process that's designed to basically form teams based on real world skills, knowledge, abilities. Students can only blame themselves in this case for who they select. So people ask me all the time about team size. My ideal team size is 3 to 5 students. When you get 6 or more, it's very hard to coordinate between the members of the team, and there's not enough work to go around. If you have 2 students, it's easy to coordinate, but there's too much work and the quality suffers. And there's limited diversity in the skills and perspectives from the members. So it's really that 3 to 5 students that becomes the sweet spot. So getting back to my team selection process, I do it during the second or third class. I give about 30 minutes. To interview each other. I don't allow team formation during that first 30 minutes. And then every so often, I tell the students to move on and meet other students. The last 10 minutes, I tell them, okay, now you can form teams. And then they go around and they form teams, and they end up have a much higher success rate of teams of people that want to work together, that have complementary skills, that basically they can't blame me for forming and forcing them into a team. So how do I evaluate some of this teamwork? One of the components that I have, and I don't know how much you have in terms of social loafing in groups over there, but I put in a component called "You're Fired," which basically allows teams to get rid of a group member with up to 2 weeks left in the term. This becomes a real motivator for students that are basically coattailing on their classmates. And the other thing that I did was I developed a comprehensive peer evaluation forms, and I let the students know that I take it very seriously. In fact, I tell my students that if they give everybody the same score on any one of these dimensions, then I will not count their score. And it will basically hurt their own grade in the class. So this is what the form looks like. My students fill it out, and then basically submit it to me. They submit it anonymously, or no, sorry, not anonymously. They submit it by themselves and slide it under my door. I don't have them submit it in class, because then the other students would see what scores they were giving each other. The other thing I tell students is I say that these scores are confidential. So if somebody doesn't do well in the course, but their team did well on all the papers, I tell them, well, you figure out where your lower grade came from. But I will not share those grades because I don't want to ruin relationships between the students. So what are some other additional questions that I've had? One of them is whether or not you should have preparation questions for students versus finding the questions. And I've gone through several debates with this, but the way that I feel is I feel that if we really want to get the real world experience for students, then they should be able to find the questions. In most cases, it's pretty obvious. The questions are at the end of the first paragraph, and they're at the end of the case, the conclusion of the case. That to me simulates a lot more of the real world than saying, here are 5 questions I want you to answer, because bosses simply aren't going to do that. So, so my recommendation is to not pre-assign questions, unless, of course, it's maybe the first case or it's freshman year, first year students or something like that. So I also get the question of people say, if I don't assign a written assignment, like a paper or memo or whatever, on a case, then the students don't participate, and they certainly don't participate at the same level. Well, one of the things that I do is I will assign specific analytical models, frameworks, tools. So most of you know Porter's 5 forces or six dimension culture or anything like that. So what I'll do is I will assign a few of those models and tell them that they need to submit via email the night before. They need to submit their models. What this does is this assures that all students have completed analysis of the assigned case. And then when you get into class, you can at least ask questions about that. This application of the analytical models demonstrates the link between the theory and practice, and it builds the student's toolkit. Now, some of you might be saying, well, I don't even know what my students do. Well, let me show you an example, and you're going to be surprised at the level of detail, but this is just a regular case analysis from my students at the University of Montana, a good school, but these are MBA students, and this is an example of one of the models that they would complete on a given case study. So if you look at the level of analysis, this was for, some of you may have done this case before, it's this case on Cisco. And what they did was they did a stakeholder analysis. Who are the stakeholders? Who are the needs? And then on the next page, they have the capabilities of the organization using framework for a value chain analysis. And then they come up with what are the distinctive competencies and core competencies. So if you can imagine, when I go into class, if the students have discussed it to this level, I can go right up on the board and start saying, well, let's talk a little bit about the value chain for this company. I draw the value chain on the board, and the students are all participating, and we're having a great discussion, and they're disagreeing and agreeing with each other and with me. And then I say, what are the distinctive and core competencies, and how does that drive the strategic alternative? If you get your students, and what it is it's about getting this culture and getting them excited about the material. If they're not excited about the material, they're not going to do this. So if you're only going to do one case during the term or 2 cases, it's probably not going to work. But if you get a rhythm going and where they see and where they're rewarded for their work, then you'll actually experience some pretty great things in class. So people also ask me, do I use a whiteboard, or do I use PowerPoint, or do an overhead projector, or do I use both? Well, typically what I do is I use a whiteboard, and I use a board plan that, as I said, is consistent every class. But then typically I will have some of my analysis I will have done, and I will have it available on PowerPoint, or maybe some things like what happened with the company and so on. So this is what my board plan looks like. I start off on the left and I run right down here. I go key issues and problems from the case. What are the key decisions to be made? Who are the stakeholders and the needs? And then I go over to the far right side. It might even be on another board in the classroom. And I go through the alternatives and the decision criteria and the implementation plan and the assumptions. And then what I do is once I have that information up, is then I say, okay, well, how do we get to the most appropriate solution that we might offer for these three alternatives that we have? And this is where in the middle I get into analytical frameworks, theories, concepts, and everything else about the industry. That's where the analysis takes place. So one of the keys with a case, so that you can make sure that the students are engaged throughout the whole discussion, is what I refer to as the takeaways method. And the takeaways is at the end of the class, the last kind of cold call questions that I ask are, what do you take away from this? What did you learn from this case? How will it help you in the future? And what that does is it makes sure that the students from the start of the class till the end of the class, because they know that they could be called on, they must be continuing to analyze and follow with the discussion. And they can't just check in, make a contribution, and then check out, because later I could call on them and say, hey, Steve, what were the takeaways for you? Name one thing you learned from this case. And that's really, really critical. So the first class session, some of the things real quickly, because I do want to get to the culture side of things. I go through the syllabus. I set the stage for cases. First of all, there is no right or wrong answer for cases. That is actually a very difficult concept for a lot of students in Asian cultures. Okay, because you're always taught that there is one solution. There is not one solution. There are parts, like there is whatever the net present value or things like that. There are components of the case that are correct or incorrect, but the solution to the case, there is no right or wrong answer. Getting that across to your students and telling them that they need to make their best substantiate analysis for the solution that they suggest makes it much easier on students to participate in class, because they're not concerned about whether or not they have the right or wrong answer. They're concerned about, are they making a good set of arguments for the solution that they came up with. I always explain to students how cases have helped me in terms of they provide these heuristics for dealing with other problems. I discuss the process, and I emphasize the 4 P's: preparation, presence, promptness, and participation. I also start, and I'd be happy to share with you, maybe I'll send along a PDF of my slides and maybe this case study. But I use this one case called Robin Hood. It's a 2-page case study, and it's a fictional tale. And what it does, it gets everybody comfortable analyzing and discussing a case study. So what are some of the cultural considerations that you need to consider in Asian versus Western environments? First of all, I want you to please remember that I have taught at Peking University. I have taught at many other universities. I have been successful with cases, because oftentimes people will just say, well, this is a Western guy and he's Babson and Cornell and he teaches at US schools. Remember, I've been successful, so please buy into the thing that I'm selling here. First of all, hopefully most of you are familiar with Hofstede's dimension dimensions of culture. If not, I recommend reading about it. It will provide a good background for how you might look at how adopting techniques, methodologies, or pedagogies from different cultures might work in your classrooms. So the first, I've taken out three of the dimensions on which the US and Hong Kong are very different on. The first is power distance, the degree to which less powerful members of a society accept that power is distributed unequally. Okay? So it's this acceptance of a distance between people based on their power. So it's a distance, for example, in the context of learning, it's the perceived distance between a professor and his or her students. In the United States, students will just come right up to me in the street and say hi. They'll call me at home. They'll come into my office hours, not during my office hours. When I taught at Peking University, I needed to teach the students how to use me as a resource, how to come by and how to feel free to do that. Uncertainty avoidance is the degree to which members of the society feel uncomfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity. So do you feel comfortable in situations where you don't know what's going to happen? And the last one is individualism and collectivism. Individualism is a preference for a loosely knit social framework in which individuals are expected to take care of themselves. Collectivism is a preference for a tightly knit framework in society in which individuals can expect the relatives and members of a particular in-group to look out for each other. So what do the scores show us? The scores show us that there is a difference on power distance, and there's a difference on individualism, and a slight difference on uncertainty avoidance. So when we look at, oops, excuse me, I have Malaysia up there. I took Malaysia out. I had an earlier version of this. But when we compare Hong Kong to the United States, for power distance, it's moderate to high, for Hong Kong, and then uncertainty avoidance is low and individualism is low. And then if you look at the USA, it's low, moderate, and high. Now, this is all fine, but what does that mean in the classroom? Well, in the classroom, when we compare Hong Kong to the United States on power distance, what does this mean? This means that in a moderate to high power distance culture, that the teacher is respected, that it's teacher-centered education. The teacher initiates communication. Teacher outlines the path to follow. Student speaks only when invited by the teacher. Students cannot contradict each other, or can't contradict the teacher, sorry. And if you look, it's kind of the opposite for the United States on all of this. So what does that mean? What that means is that just like if you were a manager going into another culture, what would you do? You would figure out how you manage differently. So you might try to do things like, for example, you might want to change your style a little bit so that the students do feel like they can maybe push you on your analysis, or that the students may be able to raise their hand or follow up or raise a hand before you ask people to raise hands. So the next one is individualism. So in Hong Kong, it's low, and on this one it means students expect to learn how to do. Students speak only when called upon. Individuals speak only in small groups. As I said before, looking at when you do a case discussion and you want to get the students comfortable, especially first-year students, they won't be exposed to case studies. You do small breakout groups to talk about various aspects of the case. And then you divide the room into a half, and you have bigger groups discuss. And then partway through the semester, you introduce so that the whole class is discussing it at one time. So in the United States, as I said, it's very different, right? And so there are things that you can do. But because one of my areas that I studied in school and because I had experience as an expatriate manager, when I was teaching at King University, I thought every night about these things. And I thought about how I could overcome some of the challenges. And I'll tell you, the 3 summers that I taught there were some of the best classes that I ever had and most engaging. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to questions now.
Right. Thanks so much for Professor Shay's sharing. Actually, I'm sure all of you have learned a lot just based on this brief section. We have gone through the whole and the most critical skills for case teaching. And my most immediate takeaway is that I need to change my course syllabus from class participation to class contribution. I think also all of you need to do so. Do you agree? Right. Do you have any questions to Professor Shay? Please feel free to share with us.
See, now you're behaving like I said you would behave.
Right.
There we go. A question.
Thanks so much for your sharing. So my question is about blended learning. So to what extent are you incorporating blended learning techniques, given, as you highlighted, various online tools that are currently available already?
One of the participants want to ask about the blended learning approach. Have you ever got experience with blended learning using different e-learning tools, etc., using and case teaching method?
Yeah, actually, I have quite a bit of experience. We were when I was at University of Montana, we were one of the first schools actually using a blended learning method, basically because Montana is so spread out. So we had part-time MBA students located in 5 cities that were probably, it would be like 900 kilometers apart. So it's quite a big distance apart. The blended learning does work, and it can work very, very well. I think the biggest thing that I found when I did that was that you needed to, one of the things that I did, for example, is I had the students, we used Blackboard there. And one of the things that we did was we had the students upload their models, right, the analytical frameworks, probably like the evening before so that people could review them during the day. And then I preferred personally for me, I preferred more of the synchronous discussions where we were all on at the same time and where I could post a question and where we could have discussions that way. That to me was much more effective than the asynchronous. The asynchronous, I felt like sometimes it got a little bit off track.
Thank you.
Right. Someone there, Florence? Wait, one more participant's question.
Yeah.
Professor Shay, so it's not so much of a question, but sharing. I think sometimes when I use a case study method, the challenge is that to encourage the student to feel that there is an element of authenticity, because they feel, is that real? And if not, then sometimes I have to do a little bit of coaching first, so that they really have to feel that they are in that situation, so as to be able to appreciate what the case study is referring to and how they can contextualize the theory and then be able to make sense from it.
Can you hear clearly, Professor Shay?
I think I heard part of it, and yeah. Let me see if
Yeah, the question is about authenticity and how you can contextualize it so that the students can understand well, because the participant asked that very often students may question whether it is authentic, and also need to have a lot of guidance or mentoring before they start the case.
Right. So, okay, so that's actually two parts. So the first one that I'll tell you is that, and this one again is different. And if you do a seminar on case research, it will bring up certain questions and kind of East versus West discussions. But all of the cases from the West, whether it's Harvard, Ivy, NACRA, any of those schools, Darden, Stanford, um, all of those cases, you just need to tell the students that they are 100% factually based. Because we don't, that would also be problematic with students in the US, that if they don't believe that it's authentic, that it's a real business problem, then they'll have no interest in analyzing it. And they'll say, this is just fictitious anyway. Nobody would ever face this problem at work. So one of the ways that you can kind of that you can overcome that is by getting more people in Asia to share their cases with each other, to write their own cases, because then they're much more likely to think that they're real. The second one is in regards to the training, coaching, mentoring the students. It depends on how committed the university is to the case method. At the University of Montana, we were able to. There was enough of us that were teaching the case method for the master's students that what we did was, as part of their orientation program, and it was me, I ran like a 2-hour session just on how to analyze case studies, how to read the case study, how to analyze it, how to come to class prepared, how to engage in discussions in teams and then in class. And it worked exceptionally well.
Right. Thanks very much. Are there more questions to Professor Shay? Yeah. Maybe I also asked that I noted that you have a very outstanding teaching evaluations and 4.7 out of 5 throughout your past 20 years. Then can you tell us that does case teaching make a significant difference based on your observation experience as you compare with your colleagues?
Yeah, it makes a significant difference. I don't it travels too. When I was I taught 5 summers at the London School of Economics, and my scores there were better than all of the London School of Economics faculty as well. And I believe that it comes in part from my case training, the fact that I went to case-based schools, and so I had a lot of experience. But then the fact that I use the cases, and that students, again, they can get information, what they think is information, from Twitter, from online, from social media, whatever they want, whenever they want. And if you're actually teaching them a real skill that they say, wow, at the end of this, like I have students right now, they're going to be sending their strategic plans to big companies like ExxonMobil, Amazon. They're going to be sending these strategic plans because they're so proud of the work that they've done. And their projects are better because they've learned how to apply over the course of the semester, 12 times to different companies. They apply these models and tools to the cases, and then their strategic plan ends up that much better. So the students see real value, and they get very engaged and excited about coming to class. And because I'm not lecturing on the same things that I've lectured on for 20 years, I'm excited to go into class, and I'm having a lot of fun doing it. So yes, I would say it makes a big difference.
But how can you also spread this kind of best practice to your colleagues? And you know that very often colleagues may think that they are teaching very well and they don't need to change. But how about this kind of community practice within your whole faculty or business school?
I will tell you, it's very, I think it's very funny. So I have two different experiences. University of Montana, every few years, they would have me teach a seminar on case teaching to all of the new faculty. And it was great. It was a lot of fun, and I had them read a case, and we did it not during the middle of a semester. We did it, during the summer or during, the late summer or something like that. And it was wonderful, and people got a lot out of it. The school that I'm at right now, I love being here. Washington and Lee is one of the top liberal arts schools, usually in the top 5 in the United States in terms of rankings. But it's very funny. The faculty are very closed to having anybody else teach them how to teach. So, my suggestion would be is that you start to get small groups of you together and you share what you're learning in class, and you attend conferences like this, and you do things like, for example, North American Case Research Association. The conference next year is in, it's a little more accessible for you because it's on towards the western side of the U.S. It's in Arizona next year. But you attend those things and you just start to build a group of people that believe in this method. And, you realize, like I started off, tonight's talk with, if you don't make changes, you are going to be obsolete. And cases are one pedagogy that will not be obsolete because you add value in the classroom. So.
Okay, right. Are there more questions? I think we have learned a lot, and we appreciate your help. And thanks so much. And we hope we have more collaboration in the near future. Right. Let us applaud and thanks Professor Shay.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it, and I hope I get to meet all of you sometime when you schedule and I don't have classes going on.